The panel that I'm moderating here today got the title Spoils of the Empire. Or maybe first of all, I want to thank the organizers for organizing this conference, because I think it's tremendously important that we have this kind of coming together and discussing about important and also critical and sensible issues that don't find place so often in other contexts. So as Christian mentioned already this morning when we were starting with the conference, the title of this panel is pointing to a very important factor, which is, and it was also raised by the previous speakers this morning, that colonialism, or what we call the colonial project, of course, does not end with the end of colonial empires. Further, when looking into the German case, we cannot reduce it to the always called comparatively short period of German colonialism or the territorial expression of it. But we have to look into how colonialism or the colonial project proceeds, how it persists, and how it still, and in the case of the ethnological museums, for example, is very obvious, how it still continues to structure relationships and how it still maintains these power structures. The presenters in this panel will engage with this persistence of the colonial empire when it comes to the question of ownership, access, and sovereignty of interpretation of sacred and cultural objects. They will all speak of their work, which is, I think in all cases, an interlinkage of academic work, activist work, and in some cases also artistic work. I think this is also something that we're going to discuss later in the panel. We will start with a presentation by Kauna Hills, born as Roxley Foley, who will talk about the remaining colonial structures and power relations in Australia, followed by a presentation by Pedro Yalivora, who presents the case of the Benin bronzes. And finally, Ronald Nietzen, who will engage with indigenous perspectives, referring to the Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act, briefly NAGRAP. After the three presentations, so we won't have questions in between, we will collect all three presentations and then we're going to meet here again on the panel or on the stage and discuss together, because I think it's very important that we have a discussion among the panelists, and of course you are all invited to engage in the discussion. So now I invite Roxley and Marion, who will introduce Roxley to the stage, and please give them a warm welcome.
Guten Tag, mein Name ist Marion CARIS und I'm honored to introduce to you the next speaker, Roxley Foley from Australia. Roxley is a Gumbaynggirr man, descendant of Gumbaynggirr descent, and he was born on Kaurna lands in what we now call Australia, South Australia. And he was born in a family of activists and has dealt already with the political struggles of Aboriginal people during his whole life. He's a story keeper of modern Aboriginal history in Australia, and he has been appointed as official custodian and sacred firekeeper of the Aboriginal Tent Embassy in Canberra. It's the oldest site of political struggle in Australia. It was installed in 1972 on the lawns opposite of Old Parliament House in Canberra. I met Roxley last year for the first time here in Berlin, and I had the privilege to work with him for 2 months. And I got to know him as a tireless fighter for Aboriginal rights and a very inspiring speaker with a great sense of humor. And as someone who has a lot of fire and a lot of love in his heart. I also got to know him as a person who feels immensely hurt by the pain that is inflicted still on his people by the current government in Australia, but also in general the Australian state and nation. And I met him also as a person who, just like many other people, many other of his people, who lives in a permanent state of exception in his own country. To me, Roxley is like a mirror, because he confronts me with the privileges that I have as a white person. And he inspires me every day to what he calls weaponize my privilege. Respect and listen, please, to Roxley Foley.
Thank you, Marion, for that very warm introduction. And I thank you all for being here too. It's quite nice to be surrounded by a group, unlike my previous talks that I've just come from in Dresden, speaking on the roles of encyclopedic museums in politically complex times. I always believe firmly in working with people on the ground level, and today I haven't prepared any form of speech or academia here for you. I'm not an academic, I'm not a historian. I don't curate any exhibitions, I'm not a museum director. These are issues that I live every day of my life. And I feel like it's important to get through to the audiences today that we have to bring this away from just the academic discussion. I don't even like using a podium, so I'm gonna wander about here a little bit and make it a little bit difficult on your cameraman here. Now, I also didn't want to get into discussing the finer details of the Australian case, because when it comes to Australia, we're still at the very infancy of having that conversation in Europe. We talk a lot about African and American and Asian colonization processes, but it still amazes me to this day that Australia is overlooked, because it was the last majorly colonized landmass in the world. Not only that, it was where the settler colonial project was perfected. The mere state and situation my people live in today is proof of that. We live in a perpetual state of invisibility within our own society. The only time our culture and art is promoted to the rest of the world is in a homogenized, whitewashed format, usurped by the Australian government to give them some sort of pride and culture and nationalism in a country that has very little culture of its own. When we look at that history, I can't stress enough the history of racism of Australia. Its founding act of federation. Let's just skip a whole 100 years of the first 100 years of British colonisation and talk about the Federation of Australia. Its founding act was a policy called the White Australia Policy. Its belief at the time was that Britain had become too polluted by its colonies and they needed a bastion of pure white supremacy to break away from the empire. The history of eugenic and settler thought in Australia has affected the entire world. We see in Australia the foundations of the Torrens land tenure system, which was the force of land registration, which was then exported to the rest of the world to deny native peoples their rights to land, and was taken up by a capitalist model across the entire world. When we look at the eugenics history, and specifically in Melbourne University, we see the eugenics thought and scientific papers that were then used here in Germany that allowed Nazi scientists to help promote their pogroms. When we look at apartheid policy, we see that first being implemented in the Queensland sugar plantations and then being exported to South Africa. What happens in Australia is not just a case of what's happening in Australia. It has very real reverberations. So when we come out here today, we're still fighting a situation for control of our cultural narratives and of our histories. Because we don't have this power at home, and this is why it's so important in the international context that our stories are told. Because if we don't have that power at home to promote our stories and our history of what's happened, we need the eyes of the international world and the attention that it brings. Historically, over the past 40 decades, the only time Australia's policy has changed in relation to my people in any form of significance has been when the international community comes together and universally condemns Australia for its actions. Today, we're living in a point where we are now the most incarcerated people on the planet. Our communities are still being forcibly removed from their lands. We still have our children being removed from our families into the modern day equivalents of the residential schools. When we talk about culture and our art and history, this is about living culture and whether or not this knowledge is going to survive to another generation. So when we come here, we want our sacred artifacts because we're in the process of a cultural renaissance of trying to revive these knowledges. We have ceremonial artifacts in many of the museums here that should be taking their place in practices still being used today. There's no excuse that these artifacts are still here. With modern technologies, 3D printing and scanning and digital archiving, why do you still need it here? Even more of an important aspect, we have the remains of our ancestors here. Now, Germany's often overlooked because when we talk about Australian colonisation, we look at Britain because they being the nation that colonised us. But because Britain fundamentally denied our humanity for the vast majority of Australian history, there were very few British and Australian anthropologists that would even accept to study us as human beings, because we were just animals and savages, and you can't do an anthropological study on someone that's not human. So consequently, most of our remains and artifacts lay scattered in their tens of thousands across Europe. Now, Berlin recently, earlier this year, handed back the last of the state-held collections of human remains, which is fantastic. But we're still yet to talk about the incredibly large amount of remains still held in private collections. And to be quite frank, I'm even more insulted that the private collections remain and the public collections have been returned. At least in some form of semblance, a public collection is safeguards of the public being able to see what's in it. But when we look at these private collections, these are old anthropologists that have claimed personal ownership on our grandfathers and great-grandfathers, in some case our own parents. As long as there's still a market for bones and scientific research on our bones, we still exist in a situation today where people we have laid to rest can be dug up, their graves robbed, and their bones sold on an international market. I can't explain the pain of having your parents dug up from a grave to satisfy this. And not only that, the last time I was actually here in Germany, we were working on a shield repatriation from the British Museum, and I don't think I even need to go into the British Museum, and that didn't go down particularly well. But whilst we were out here, we were still finding our sacred artifacts and our turingas on eBay, and having to explain to eBay why there is international law preventing the sale of these objects, because they just consider it a bunch of stones with some random carvings in it. This isn't something that's just relegated to the past. But part of my mission here is not just to get these items back, it's to build a real relationship. Because as much as these European institutions are talking about making their institutions less Eurocentric and decolonizing their institutions, they're still coming from the position that they're the only ones capable of doing it. They speak to many of my colleagues from Africa who are doing amazing works with their institutions, and perhaps we have to look away from Europe to actually take those examples of how to move forward. But in Dresden, for example, I spoke with Hartwig Fischer, the director of the British Museum, and he really loves to hear himself speak. He's a nice enough guy, but he was talking a lot about the modern institutions being lending institutions and mobilizing their collections, which sounds great and all, but through my own personal experiences, I know that when they say lend, that they mean keeping the ownership of the objects and lending our own objects back to us. Well, if we really want to talk about a real respectful relationship based on equality, how about you give back the objects to us and we'll lend them to you? And I think you'll find that we come from a position of more generosity than the European institutions do themselves, because we actually want to promote a world of understanding, of having our stories told, especially for my people, because we know that if our stories aren't told on our own terms, that they'll be lost, that we'll be relegated to the pages of the history. These ethnographic historical collections will be all that's left. But if you allow us a position of representation and having our voices heard, we actually, the European institutions stand to gain something. I've seen these collections. They're boring as hell. You don't know what you've got in it. And especially here in Berlin, where half the collections, the catalogues of the collections have been lost during wartime, yet there's so much pride that they refuse to come and ask us what these objects actually are. They maintain this position of a very white, patriarchal, anthropological view that they are the only ones that can truly understand what's in these collections. It amazes me going through these collections that we have to wear these gloves and these masks because they've coated them in all elements of these hideously poisonous chemicals. Where if they just come and asked us, we're used to passing on our objects for almost a millennia and protecting them for time immemorial. We could have given you plenty of natural oils and preservatives that wouldn't have given you cancer in the process of holding them. In fact, one of my the elders I work with from the Aranta country, the Hart Uluru, or Ezrock, if you know it, has a family shield passed down to him over 700 years that still looks almost as if it was made yesterday. Yet the shield that we tried to repatriate from the British Museum was in the most horrendous state of disrepair. Yet they have the arrogance to tell us that they're protecting this object, that by them keeping it, that they allow over 7 million people a year an opportunity to learn from this object, when it sits in a corner with no history attached to it whatsoever, amongst a bunch of random thieved objects from the South Pacific. It truly hurts my brain sometimes. But this is why I'm interested in what's happening with the Humboldt Forum. I'm utterly shocked that such an imperial palace would be rebuilt. I like to think that, and one of the reasons I like to work in Germany is there seems to be some actual respect towards the need for dealing with history. And I think if any country can have some sympathy to what's going on at home for my people, the conversation should be able to be had here. But we don't have the support of our government. They continually try and whitewash our story. The Australian film Biennale that happens here regularly, years ago, used to show many politically based films about my people, but since they came up for struggling of funding and started getting funded by the Australian Embassy, they now have completely whitewashed any content of Indigenous Australia. So we're looking for a new foothold into Europe. We remember that we have friends here, and that these partnerships have been ever so important, and not just with Europe, with the entire world. But the more that museums and galleries are being used to nationalize their collections and create narratives of state building, we see a need to counter this, to actually give the power of the culture to the people whose culture is in there, because none of us, they can't tell the stories as good as we can. And if we can truly mobilize these collections in equal partnership where we own our own, we can break away from these institutions just being a place that tourists go. Because what good are these cultural institutions if they're not doing something to engage with their local community and provide a space of cultural reflection over what the nation is doing and the understanding of each other from across the world? So we need help. this is the biggest thing that I can get through here at the moment. And I know through the past experiences, in fact, I find it quite funny that I'm actually standing here 30 years later from when my father first did these journeys. I actually have one of my father's old colleagues from the day here in the audience. We were having this conversation 30 years ago. And I'm here having to have the same conversation again. It warms my heart that that conversation back then has had reverberations, and it was the first of its kind. But many people think that my father might be proud that I'm here, but it's an indictment that I have to carry on this work, and that we have to continue these stories because things have gone so backwards in the time that has been. We really need that conversation, because when I look at the history of Australia, we talk a lot about the pain and the traumatization process that we went through colonisation. I think Europe needs a mirror to look at itself, to look through the historical processes that the church, that industrialization, that imperialism, all these things have had damage on their own country. Because when we talk about understanding my people's knowledges, we're talking about bringing back levels of efficiency and sustainability in ecological circumstances, in governance. We're not talking about reflecting on something past gone and something noble savage. We're talking about the fundamental essences of all our people of this world that have been so successful for the vast majority of our history, and that we need both a new cultural revolution and a new industrial revolution to bring back that healing. And we're not just here looking for help, that we're truly here looking to help Europe and help promote some healing here. And that we want to work together in a true partnership with true respect and true understanding. And I'm here to speak. I don't like talking at people. I want to sit in a real circle with you all and have some proper conversations and some long talks. So I'm going to be here till December. And through the organisers of this conference, anyone that's willing to help, I'm willing to sit down and have a conversation with you. Thank you.